Brendan O'Neill is my favourite Marxist by far. He started writing for Living Marxisms, published by Britain's Revolutionary Communist Party, and is now editor of Spiked Online and a columnist for The Australian as well as The Big Issue. He still insists of the left, but is most of all a libertarian and a great enemy of bullies trying to muzzle us and control us. He is a fearless and brilliant writer and is now touring Australia for the Institute of Public Affairs. It's my pleasure to have him on again as a guest. Brendan, it's great to see you, mate.
Hi, Andrew.
Now, listen, I've got to ask, are you now, or have you ever been, really a Marxist?
I think so, yeah. I consider myself a very old-fashioned leftist, the kind that used to be, interested in liberation, interested in counterculture, interested in new ideas, and most importantly, interested in freedom of speech. There was a time, a long time ago, when the left was actually interested in freedom of speech, but it's so long ago, most people have very understandably forgotten it.
I find it interesting. I'm portrayed, well, I did work for Labor, but I'm portrayed as far right, etc., which I don't accept, but that's how I'm portrayed. I find it odd that you and I are, on so many fronts, the same. How do you explain that?
I think the real dividing line today is not really between right and left. It's more between, do you believe in freedom or do you not believe in freedom? Do you trust people to be able to run their own lives without needing the scaffolding of the nanny state and all these finger waggers and all these censors trying to control what we can see and hear and do? Or do you think that people need that control? Do you think people need all that intervention in their lives? I think that's the new dividing line. It's a question of how far do you trust ordinary people to be free? And it's unfortunate that most of the left now doesn't trust ordinary people to be free, thinks we need laws and regulations and controls to tell us what to do. A few people on the right still do trust ordinary people, so that's quite interesting. But I think we're seeing new alliances emerging between right and left coming together, saying that we've had enough of this kind of nanny statism.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more, Brendan. And I think one of the differences there between the left and the right is that the right tends to hope for tradition to do the work of guiding people to the right path, while the left tends to look for the law to do that, which is a much harder instrument.
Exactly, and the left is now utterly pro-state in a really quite depressing way. The left seems to view it, the more it's lost faith in ordinary people, the more it's warmed to the state, and it sees the state as the solution to every problem in society. If there's hatred or crime or people getting a bit fatter than they ought to be, or people drinking too much, their instant response is, let's call on the state to sort this problem out. So they have this extremely authoritarian knee-jerk instinct which says that every social problem has to have a solution that comes from the top down. And of course all that generates is more authoritarianism, less freedom, and a really censorious climate.
Now listen, Brendan, I got to restore your Marxist credentials here after having tried to destroy them just then. There is actually, I go along with it insofar as believing that we do have classes in society. They're very loose and sometimes they overlap like a Venn diagram, but classes. And I would say today that the predominant class, the dominant, strongest class, is no longer the capitalists with the top hat. It's the political and media class that strikes me as being so interfering. How do you see it and how does that class work?
I completely agree. I think it's kind of the middle class. I know Australia has a very different understanding of the middle class to us in Britain. It's the chattering class, I think, because the two great classes of the past, you had the ruling class on one side, the kind of top hat people, and you had the working class on the other, the kind of cloth cap people, and they were loggerheads for basically 200 years. But both of those classes have, for various reasons, kind of lost their influence, lost their clout, become shadows of their former selves. And I think as a result of that, the middle class, the kind of chattering class, that section in the middle of those two classes, has become more and more powerful by default. And that's why I think over the past 20 years or so, we've seen that class play a much more influential role in everyday life. And it's an often quite mean-spirited class of people, the chattering class, ungenerous, distrustful of the public. Because it lives in its own kind of rarefied bubble, it has this kind of view of other people as basically untrustworthy, racist, problematic, unhealthy, people who need to be re-educated and fixed. And they see it as their role to re-educate us and fix us. So I think as those two great classes of old have kind of lost their way, this new poisonous kind of interventionist class has taken over, and that's a real worry, I think.
No, well, I think it's drunk on its own power. But, Brendan, one of the newer kind of classes that I see being formed in front of my eyes, or reformed, as it probably is more accurate, through tribalism and this new racism, this division of us into identity groups, that's been created and given and bolstered and protected with legislative power. How threatening do you find that?
I think it's abhorrent. I think we're witnessing the re-racialisation of society. What we had in the 50s and 60s were these great movements calling for equality, as summed up by Martin Luther King and his dream of a future in which people would be judged by the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin. Now we are backtracking on that. We have the opposite of that, where we encourage people to judge others on the colour of their skin. Are you black? Are you white? What identity group do you come from? What ethnic minority do you come from? Or what sexual orientation are you? What sex are you? What gender are you? We're constantly pushing people back into the biological and racial boxes that men and women struggle to escape from for so long. So I think identity politics is really winding history backwards and taking us to a time when men were seen as utterly different to women and black people were seen as utterly different to white people. It's an extremely divisive logic, and I think it's unravelling society in a very pernicious way.
Well, look, I think it's obscene and an insult to our common humanity. But you know what really disturbs me, Brendan, is not just that this is happening, but that what is protecting it are new laws that are actually being used to stop us from protesting against it. You know, if you actually complain against this new racism, there are laws now to make you seem like you're the racist yourself, and you've got to front a court to actually defend your position.
Exactly, and you know, Section 18C is a very good example of that, where you have this QUT case, where basically the students criticise the idea of having a segregated laboratory for Indigenous students, and for criticising segregation, they now find themselves in trouble. On some American campuses, they have this thing called microaggression, which is terms and words that could potentially hurt other people, and they say that things like, you know, if you say the Martin Luther King line, I judge people by character, not colour, that is now considered a microaggression on some campuses in America because it apparently denies people's racial experiences. So we are constantly invited and forced, in fact, as you say, by the law, to work with other people and engage with other people and relate to other people racially. We are encouraged to think racially, to behave in this very racial manner, and I really find that deeply unpleasant. I'm someone who, I started my political career as an anti-racist. I was always very interested in bringing about a situation of proper equality and freedom for all people. Now we have a situation where that's been undone by the very people who describe themselves as progressive, and that's a real worry.
Honestly, Brendan, sometimes I feel like a bit like Gregory of Tours, who's seeing the Frankish barbarians come into Gaul and not being able to do anything about it. But listen, you know, it's a natural thing, of course, for us, for humans, to look for affinity groups and in their weaker moments to define themselves by a collective rather than as individuals, particularly if you're weak. Are we being too blind, too idealistic to think that what we were aiming for, a society where people were colourblind, blind also to class, you know, that was just never going to happen?
No, I think we have to hope that that is still a possibility. And I think the thing standing in its way now is this new politics of identity, this new identitarianism, which constantly tells us that we are a biological creature or a racial creature, or we're just a gender. There's nothing more to us than that. There's nothing in your character or your personality which is more interesting. I think we have to wage war against that as much as possible and hold on to the idea that so many people fought and died for, which is that human beings are fundamentally the same in many ways and have the capacity to be equal. They have the shared capacity for moral autonomy, for freedom, for wanting to create a better life for themselves. All those great ideas are being called into question by this new backward politics, and I think it really needs to be confronted at every opportunity.
Brendan, you're so right. And may I congratulate you on flying the flag on Q&A last night. Outnumbered, as always, when you someone speaks sense. I thought you carried the battle very well. Congratulations.
Thanks, Andrew.
And thanks for dropping by in Australia, mate.
Thank you.
If you want to catch more of Brendan O'Neill as he talks his way around Australia, click onto the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs website. You'll find more details. Well, coming up, we have a great man, in my opinion, one of the great Australians, who's going to tackle this question: how do you waste $6 billion a year? How do you waste it? And plus, we'll talk about journalistic groupthink exposed.